Ladies and gentlemen, when President Bush left office in 2008, President Obama inherited 2 wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan. He also had to deal with the rising power in Russia and in China, and what he needed to do was to create more stable regions, and he needed to increase and maintain the soft power by building further alliances with other countries. Well, we say that under the context in which Obama inherited the United States' highest office, what he needed to do was that it was best for the United States and the world to finish the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and to leave these regions more stable than when they first came. And second, what they needed to do was to stand strong against Russia and other rising powers to prevent expansionism in other areas. What we say is that Obama has not done this, and their foreign policy has been failure. He abandoned the use of force when America needed it the most, and we say that he has not dealt with the instability that has arisen during his term. We also say that the metrics by which we're going to measure this debate is we're not simply going to list out all the possible harms of the Obama foreign policy and all the possible benefits of the foreign policy. We're not going to measure them by the number. What we're going to do is we're going to look at each situation and we're going to tell you, we're going to measure this foreign policy by what he could have reasonably achieved under another context later, please. What we're going to say is we're going to look at the situation, we're going to look at what Obama chose to do and what other actions he could have taken, but we're going to measure the harms and benefits of what he did compared to what he could have reasonably done otherwise. I'm going to talk about, the refusal of intervention that Obama did in the Middle East and also in parts of Europe, and why that led to more unstable regions overall. And my second speaker, Karen, is going to talk about how Obama and the administration has consistently misidentified the real threats, and he has not been able to use soft power when he needed it the most. But before I move on to my substantive arguments, please.
Is preventing harm a benefit on your side of the house?
Sorry?
Is preventing harm a benefit on your side of the house?
We say that if you can reasonably prove that by doing a certain policy he has been able to prevent a concrete harm, then sure, we can take that. Okay, now I'm going to move on to my substantive. Now let's explain. So when Obama first ran for president in 2008, one of the strongest points in his campaign was that he created a political identity for himself that was very different to that of President Bush. President Bush was very interventionist. President Bush advocated for wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he intervened in the Middle East on many occasions. What Obama did during his election was that he promised the American people that he was going to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, he was going to take the troops back, and that he was going to do as much as he could to not involve himself further in further wars. What we say is that even though this is a good point to stand on, first of all, we say that this directly clashes with the United States' traditional responsibility to protect, that this kind of idealism has always been supported by America. They've always advocated that in the event that a government oppresses or harms their own people, it is all right for their sovereignty to be violated. It is all right for other countries to go in and to protect their own people from their government. And the United States in the past, they've always acted on this, and we say that it is their responsibility as a member of the international community to act on that. We also say that Obama seems to hold on to this ideological dogma of non-interventionism, to the point of almost inflexibility. He has held on to this idea that he wants to delineate his identity from Bush. He never intervenes, he never wants to continue or further any kind of discourse, even when America and these regions need it more. What we say is that he has held back from this to the point where it's actually harmed those regions and created more instability. Now, an example of this is when Obama pulled out of Iraq and Afghanistan. We say that it's okay for him to pull out of Iraq and Afghanistan, but the way that he did it was so detrimental to that place that we cannot abide it. What he did was that he pledged to pull out his troops. And in Iraq, for example, he pulled out the ground troops, all of the ground troops, on the eve of the 2012 elections, right before he was about to go into another election cycle. First of all, we think that the way that he pulled it out was too fast, that he did not leave a strong and stable army in place that could deal with the rising powers of ISIS and of other extremist forces. And what this led was to a power vacuum that allowed insurgency groups to come in and to take over the region. And what we say is that what Obama could have done is he could have stayed and he could have trained the troops more, and he could have pulled out slowly. While we say that it was beneficial for him as a political candidate to fulfill his campaign promises, it was hugely detrimental to the American foreign policy overall, because they left this huge power vacuum that allowed these extremist forces to go in and made the region even more unstable than America had originally done by invading it in the first place. Go.
When the Iraqi parliament makes it clear that they want the United States of America to leave, what choice does Obama have to stay?
Okay, we say that yes, the Iraqi government, if they do think that Obama needs to leave, then yeah, then Obama may be able to leave. But we say that still, Obama should have taken precautions even while he was in Iraq. We say that during this time, a lot of Obama's foreign policy advisors and a lot of his military advisors told him that he still needed to train the Iraqi army to the point where they could defend themselves, where the government could defend their own sovereignty. We say that he has not fulfilled that. He did not choose to take that choice, even when it was immediately available to him. And what was happened is that the Iraqi government is not able to defend themselves, and this has also led to the rise of these insurgency groups, which we think are enormous of that. Now, we also say that in the case of Afghanistan, Obama decreased the amount of ground troops in Afghanistan from 100,000 to only 8,400 in the span of a really, really short time. And we say that, first of all, they pulled out too fast. Most military experts do agree that by leaving this, once again, without a trained army and a stable government, led to the rise of the Taliban. Now, in 2015, the Taliban took over one of the major cities in Afghanistan, Kunduz, and they did this like after Obama left, and we said that this could have been prevented otherwise. We also say that Obama intervened way too slow in Syria, that when Obama made a statement that he was going to support civil uprisings in the Arab Spring if it was civilians against the government, he did not provide the necessary military help to the Syrian rebels, which led to the fact that Assad was able to draw out this war over a longer amount of time to hurt more civilians. And this also led to this very unequal power struggle that led to ISIS and these other extremist groups being able to come in and to harm the region even more. And secondly, even when he attempted to draw these red lines of saying, if you cross this line, then I will intervene, he also failed. Now, in 2011, he said, if Assad uses chemical weapons against the Syrian people, then I will step in. Well, in 2013, the Assad regime, they used chemical weapons against civilians in Damascus, women, children. They used sarin gas, this kind of poisonous gas, odorless, and these people convulsed. They died very, very slow deaths. What happened even after this happened is all of Obama's foreign policy advisors told him, you have to go in, you have to maintain America's power, you have to prove to them that America does follow up on their promises. But Obama chose to step back. He did not send in ground troops as he had previously promised. And what happened was this greatly damaged America's credibility in the foreign policy sphere. And we say that this is a huge damage in and of itself. Mainly because, firstly, America has always relied on this idea of threat power, right? This is what Clinton called America's brand image, which is that when America says they're going to do something, people think they're going to follow through. This is why America is a reliable partner in international relations, and this is why this often stops governments from going rogue or doing things that could destabilize the region further. So first of all, this hugely damaged America's foreign policy in the future because people no longer think of America as a credible source. And second of all, this also led to the suffering of the Syrian civilians and these Syrian refugees flooding to Europe, and also this kind of huge resettlement within the Middle East. What we say is that this has proved that Obama has routinely ignored other policies that they could have taken to stabilize the regions, and that he has not done his role even when there was an immediately available option for him. And we say that because of those reasons, because we think Obama did not take the best policy when he could, we think that he has done more harm than good. We are very proud to propose.
Now first speaker for the opposition, Carthy.
When Obama has used diplomacy to build a groundbreaking climate change agreement and a visionary nuclear deal, and used diplomacy instead of military measures to actually bring democracy to countries, we reject the idea that his foreign policy should be judged on a purely military basis. We think Obama's vision has created benefits to the world and limited harms wherever it was possible. That's why we think Obama was a prudent POTUS. Our burden today is to show you that within the boundaries of realistic choices, Obama's decision produced overall better outcomes. Notice how they concede that preventing harm is a benefit in this case. It's not just creating better regimes or creating better outcomes that helps. It's preventing harms that are almost certain to happen. That's what we think Obama has done. Their side has to actually not just list some bad examples, but show how objectively better alternatives existed, that Obama chose the worst ones. Notice how they asserted that better alternatives existed, like intervention, but didn't in a single instance iterate how it would have been better, how that might not have been Iraq 2.0. They need to come in their second speech and actually defend these alternatives, show how they would have worked better in order to show their burden. So we think that, okay, in my speech I'll show you two tremendous successes of Obama. First, on reducing nuclear tension, and second, in combating climate change. My second speaker will talk about Obama's successes in bringing democracy. But before that, some rebuttal. First, they talked about how he shouldn't have campaigned on an anti-war platform. Remember that the majority of the US population is anti-war. It's completely illegitimate to say that a US president shouldn't represent the wishes of the US people. That's something they have to defend. Second, they talked about their main argument, the strongest argument was on his refusal to intervene, right? Three examples here, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Let me deconstruct each of them. First, on Iraq and Afghanistan. Their side conceded that if the Iraqi government and Afghanistan government didn't want them, then the US should have left. That is exactly what happened. When President Bush signed the Status of Forces Agreement in 2008, it was he who signed the agreement to withdraw troops. And then it was the Iraqi parliament who refused to approve an extension to the presence of US troops. That's why Obama had to withdraw. Clearly, it was the government who decided that the US wasn't welcome. That's why it's perfectly legitimate, even by their criteria. Next, on Afghanistan, how it pulled out too fast. The fact is the US has trained the Afghan National Security Forces, the Afghan National Police, given them equipment. It's focused on training local police forces in a sustainable manner instead of putting white troops on the ground who are inevitably going to be hated by the local population and stimulate Taliban recruitment. We think that's much more beneficial than the comparative, which is an extended engagement which would have much more led to much more Taliban recruitment even on their side. Finally, on Syria, the red line and deterrence in Syria, this is the majority of the case, right? The fact is Obama did get rid of the chemical weapons. The fact is he did, in the space of 2 weeks, use diplomacy with Russia to get rid of all chemical weapons in Syria. That's a benefit that he could get without invading Syria, without sending thousands of troops in, leading to hundreds of thousands of people dying. So he was able to achieve his aims without actually putting troops on the ground. We think that's a benefit in and of itself. Moreover, deterrence is kind of overrated, right? The fact is, it's the kind of thing that led to Vietnam. The fact that you should bomb someone just to show that you can bomb someone is quite stupid. That's what Obama recognized. If you cannot accomplish an actual goal, a clear goal with deterrence, then it's not worth it. The fact that he solved the problem he tried to solve and he solved the problem he could solve, didn't try to get into solving a problem, the entire Middle East, that's what we think his foreign policy was pragmatic. So now let me move to my constructive. So before I examine the outcomes, a clear filter through which we must view this debate is his prioritization of foreign policy goals. Obama recognized the most important threats to humanity and set the goals of US foreign policy as combating those threats by finding common ground wherever feasible. Certain issues had no scope for common ground, like Syria. Even then, he tried to give Syrian actors common ground through power sharing, through ceasefires. The fact that they couldn't do this is something the US could not control. There's a clear trade-off between certain goals. You can't antagonize Russia in Crimea, then expect them to work with you on climate change and nuclear stockpile reduction, right? So the issues must always be weighed against each other to see which are more important. And the biggest issues in this context required a collective effort to combat. And virtually every president before Obama failed to build one. That's why the Iran nuclear negotiations in 2003 failed, because there was no global consensus on the sanctions. That's why the Kyoto Protocol failed when major industrial economies refused to ratify it. Building a consensus required reaching out to traditional US adversaries. Obama was able to do that beautifully. How? First, in reducing nuclear tensions. We saw this in the Iran nuclear deal and in negotiations with Russia. First, on the Iran nuclear deal. With Iran, prior sanctions failed to bring about a deal because the US and its allies sanctioned Iran without global consensus. For example, 1 minute, Asian countries were happy to trade with Iran even though the sanctions were in place, so they didn't actually have enough fight to force Iran to a deal and force Iran to the table and get a deal. Yes?
We believe that hundreds of thousands of people dying in Syria is more important than a nuclear.
This motion is not hundreds of thousands of people have died while Obama was president. The motion requires you to prove that Obama was responsible for those hundreds of thousands thousands of people dying. The fact is, the Syrian civil war would almost inevitably have happened without Obama in the first place. You have to establish some kind of causal link and not just say this bad thing happened while he was president. Moreover, while Asian countries weren't willing to enforce sanctions, Obama finally lobbied them in order to stop trading with Iran and build a truly global consensus on the sanctions. That's why Iran was eventually forced to accept a deal which crippled its nuclear ambitions. And let's look at what exactly the Iran deal did, right? It made Iran give up 98% of its nuclear material, dismantle 20,000 nuclear centrifuges, consent to IAEA inspections of its facilities, and dismantle its biggest reactors. Most importantly, it created a concrete mechanism to snap sanctions back onto Iran if it violates any of these terms. This is an incredible deal. But before the deal, there was growing fear in Israel of a nuclear Iran, and the government was seriously considering airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facility, which would almost have certainly led into an all-out war. But now Israel's military establishment has applauded the Iran deal, and 67 generals have signed an open letter to Netanyahu to accept it, and support for drastic measures has fallen. Obama brought a diplomatic solution and solved the problem that they thought only military measures could solve. Moreover, Iran has increased trade with the rest of the world and become more closely integrated with the world economy. This turned Iran from a rogue state that was isolated from half the world and likely to cause a conflict into a country willing to engage with the world diplomatically. That's a huge benefit that Obama engineered. This is why it's a prevented harm that is so important on our side, something that they have conceded to. Second, negotiating with Russia to reduce nuclear stockpiles even during the Crimea crisis. Signing the New START treaty to reduce warheads from 30,000 nuclear warheads to 1,500. He clearly prioritized reducing the threat of nuclear war over some territorial squabbles in Russia's own neighborhood that they would always have won. Second, on climate change. Let's be clear. Climate change is the single biggest threat to our species. And until Obama's presidency, all efforts to solve this problem had failed. The US refused to sign on to the Kyoto Protocol, and as a result, every other major industrial company refused to honor their obligations because they didn't want to lose an edge to the US. Building global consensus up to Paris was very difficult for the US in light of its past actions, but Obama built credibility for his administration by using executive orders to pass strict domestic policy on air pollution and environmental regulations. He sent a high-powered delegation to Paris, led by John Kerry, to prove that he was serious about climate change. This high-powered delegation was responsible for negotiating concessions from China and India and getting them to negotiate a binding framework that they are going to present to their people and say, we are finally going to reduce carbon emissions, we are finally going to stop this existential threat to humanity. The fact is, with climate change, Obama built a global consensus, reached across traditional hostilities, like with China, and built a necessary consensus to combat an existential threat to humankind. The fact is, he recognized the most important foreign policy goals, he tried to limit harm wherever it was possible. Obama was a prudent POTUS, proud to oppose.
Now we welcome the second speaker of the proposition, Karen.
What team opposition today came up here and told you is that because Obama seemed to have achieved a better climate policy and had achieved seemingly better ties with the other countries, therefore all the other mistakes he had done automatically means he has achieved what he actually reasonably could under our context. They have ignored my previous speaker's speech about how he actually caused more harm military-wise to the other nations.
So first of all, I'm going to tell you a couple rebuttals up to my previous speaker, and then second of all, I'm going to talk about how, first of all, the Iran nuclear deal is not that good to begin with. Second, and I'm going to talk about how China's expansionism currently is actually a response to America first. And thirdly, I'm going to talk about how America right now is actually losing the soft power and losing the influence they compared to what they originally had. So first of all, on my rebuttals to the previous speaker, they came up here and told us how right now they had achieved a better climate change policy with Russia and how they have overall better ties. But what happened is that actually, when Obama administration came in, they said that they would have a reset policy with Russia and they're going to suddenly become friends with Russia. But what exactly had that achieved? What they had achieved in return is only a better climate change policy. And what Russia had actually done is the annexation of Crimea and allowed Russia to actually threaten these other European countries. And we don't see how a better climate change policy actually evens out the harm, as they say, Russia going out and annexing these other countries. We don't see how a climate change policy actually means Russia can go out and disrespect these other countries' sovereignty, and we don't see how that justifies Americans actually not stepping in when that has been the principle and their policy in the first place for many years. And secondly, they have failed to actually engage with our context as to how we say we are judging this debate by how his foreign companies, compared to what else he could have reasonably been done, could actually achieve, let's say, better results. And my first speaker had proven to you why that is. We have proven to you why doing what he did, he actually caused more harm. It's something which he could have actually a result which he would not have reached if he had gone into other results, but he chose not to, simply because he stuck to the ideology that he wants to differentiate from Bush, that he doesn't want to intervene. And we believe that is not a good enough reason for to simply disregard the realities that what Pew could have done could have saved more people. So on to my first argument as to how...
Point of information.
Later, please. On to my first argument, which is a direct response to what they talked about, the Iran nuclear deal. So first of all, I will tell you why the Iran nuclear deal is actually already found on rumors. Secondly, it's actually not a good deal anyways. Thirdly, I'm going to tell you how they actually wasted this bargaining chance. And fourthly, I will tell you how it actually legitimizes the human rights violation already going on in Iran. So firstly, I talked about how the Iran nuclear deal is already such a good idea, how it decreases the nuclear tension. Well, first of all, this deal is actually only founded on the rumors circulating in Washington. How the Obama administration said that there are nuclear weapon production in Iran. So we have three responses to that. First of all, there's actually no proof as to how there's actually nuclear weapons production in Iran. And there's actually the report that has been affirmed by the National Intelligence Estimate of December 2007, and thirdly, it has also been confirmed in every report by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And what Obama administration actually responded to this was saying that all that was just a stunt. They said all this is just to fool the international community. So for that, we already don't see how the Iran nuclear danger in Iran is already that great to begin with. And even if all that doesn't stand, we still say there's actually not that much of an incentive or reason for Iran to even actually try to use a nuclear weapon, because for them that automatically means national suicide. Because if we actually compare it like this, who actually has more nuclear power compared to Iran? Of course, there are already more countries who have more nuclear power, so we don't see how the nuclear danger in Iran is already so imminent. Now, before I move on, yes.
Has U.S. intervention in the Middle East ever been successful?
Yes, thank you for that point. However, the idea we're talking about, how by achieving the Iran nuclear deal is actually not achieving that much, and secondly, they also sacrifice other aspects which they could have been focusing on. So on my third point, as to how by actually achieving this nuclear deal with Iran, they actually legitimize the human rights violation, the more imminent. However, that Rouhani is actually, the Iranian president actually did do a lot of human rights violations. The number of people killed for political reasons has actually increased by 316% in Rouhani's first term. And what the real danger to that is that it actually legitimizes the human rights violation, because we see that Rouhani actually came into power after Ahmadinejad, who actually led Iran into this term of isolation. So already Rouhani will seem like the more liberal president, and since they already seem to have a cooperation with the Western world, we see that by doing this, the United States, the Obama administration is actually legitimizing the human rights violation and saying that these are actually people who cooperate with the Western world. and we see that actually decreases the amount of scrutinization that can actually go into Iran. And they also should have focused on stabilizing the entire region, which instead of focusing on Iran.
Point of information.
Later, please. And also, even if the nuclear deal still stands, it's still not that good in the first place because the nuclear deal actually entails that it's 15 to 25 years. And second of all, it also has a lot of criteria it actually has to meet. So it has to first alert around 24 days before they go in there and inspect. And second of all, they also have to have substantial evidence before they actually go in. This means that even if you actually want to keep an eye on Iran's nuclear deals, first of all, it already provides a more difficult method for people to actually go in and inspect. So if your method is actually trying to solve the nuclear tensions in Iran, we don't see how that is actually going to solve it. And secondly, we see that they have wasted their bargaining chances. Because we see the sanctions on Iran right now, it has a big incentive because they froze the bank accounts of these higher Iran officials, these people who are powerful who can actually push for change and embargo their oil sale. These are massive incentives for Iran to actually cooperate with the Obama administration, and they have wasted all that on achieving a deal that wasn't that helpful to begin with. And my second argument on China's expansionism. So first of all, we say that China's expansionism right now might seem like an aggressive move on their part, which is exactly, in fact, a response to the United States direction in the first place. Because we see that China right now is insecure. They think that the United States doesn't see itself as an equal power in the Asian region. Because what America has did currently is invite Taiwan to one of its largest military exercises and increase its military presence in the Asian region. We see China right now feels that it has a need to reinsert its power. But what America could have done is actually de-escalate the tension. They misjudged their intentions in this case and actually increase the tension, because we see China actually does not have an incentive to actually go out there and actually engage in active military exercise. We see this in two cases. First of all, guys, we are from Taiwan, and we can say our new president has pretty much said everything that China warned us not to. And China still did not actually engage in military attacks as they said they would. We have pretty much said all the independence rhetorics that China hates so much. And secondly, the islands in South China Sea, international court had awarded them to Philippines. Though outwardly, China expressed that it has a lot of protests, it's going to go military, but in fact, internally, it is suppressing the overly nationalistic voices of going to war. So we see in this case, it has proven that China is only trying to reinsert the image that is actually tough, but is not going to actively go out to engage in military-wise, which is why we don't see America has to re-engage in such an aggressive term, and in fact, escalating the overall tensions in Asia, which is why we believe so far his foreign policy has only increased the tension in the world, and only a climate change policy is not enough to balance that out.
Thank you. We welcome the second speaker for the proposition for Heman.
Go, Heman. And Taiwan talks to you about how the US didn't go to war, about how the US abandoned conventional Washington listening, we say it is an active benefit that they did it that way. What they fail to remember is the history of botched and failed interventions and wars the US has had as a result of its unilateralism. They fail to acknowledge the culture that we face, moving from Vietnam to Somalia to Iraq. They fail to understand how our intervention in Middle Eastern conflicts, where we go to war and put troops on the ground, has ultimately resulted in massive bloodshed. They failed to engage with the analysis we presented in our first speech, where we told you how we, as a result of a lack of information, terrain, and multiple other structural problems, and the fact that putting white soldiers on the ground only exacerbates anti-West sentiments and rhetoric, it only perpetuates conflict by putting troops on the ground. And therefore, we told you that no, by abandoning unilateralism and trigger happiness, Obama has recognized the shortcomings of existing foreign policy and approached peace and diplomacy. When we asked them about this and pushed them to engage with us, they thanked us and pretended we didn't explain anything. They failed to understand the big picture in this debate of comparative between being an egotic president who goes to war at every chance just to assert blind and bloody power, but rather than and being a global unchecked vigilante. We detest that. 4 areas of clash. First, let's talk about conflict management. The filter they failed to understand that we established in our first speech is that for them to show more harm than good, they have to firstly tell us why there were objectively better alternatives that Obama could have taken. They can't just debate this debate in a vacuum and say, no, there was some form of collateral damage, or go, Obama was bad. They have to tell us what trade-offs that could have happened weren't made. Therefore, given that collateral damage is often inevitable in conflict, we've been showing you how net utility of non-intervention and diplomacy has been beneficial. But the second thing they failed to understand that we have to filter this debate through is priorities. We established in our first speech how things like nuclear disarmament and things like climate change are bigger existential threats than some form of conflict that is always happening in the Middle East, given the history of the Middle East and given the decades and centuries of conflict. Under this filter, we've already won this debate. But let's look at what the specific things they told us. First, they talked to you about us having left Iraq. We have 3 responses to this. First, Iraq wanted us to leave, and therefore still staying in Iraq would have been a breach of sovereignty and would have only exacerbated the conflict in the Middle East. But second, it is a lie that Obama was solely responsible for leaving Iraq. Bush signed the States of Forces Agreement in 2008 that mandated us to leave Iraq. But third, it's also a lie that we left Iraq too soon. 13 years and a lot of resentment doesn't sound too soon. Next thing, Afghanistan. The comparative we established in our first speech was training Afghan soldiers versus placing white soldiers in Afghanistan, where in a culture where the Taliban was already using their presence for mobilizing rhetoric. And that is what they want by exacerbating the conflict. The next example they gave you was Syria. They started this example with a lie when they told you that Obama was not funding rebels. No, Obama has been the first president to fund the Kurds despite Turkish opposition, for example. He's been the first president to fund the Free Syrian Army in Syria. He's recognized the importance of local ground troops over white soldiers, and that's the comparative we push. But second, Taiwan can't say that just because Syria happened during Obama, which was kind of inevitable given the nature of conflict in the Middle East, that Obama was responsible for Syria. But finally, we argue about the chemical weapons point. If their alternative is intervention, we have to engage with our first figures analysis as to how it only resulted in a second version of Iraq. Second area of rebuttal, power threats. So what they mean by this power threat is the idea of Western suppression in all conflicts, and that's how local terrorist groups are going to spin it up. But at discounting this, we think what they failed to recognize was that we can't antagonize nations and also work together with them on other issues. That is to say that we can't engage with China in warfare in the South China Sea and also expect them to change Beijing, which is polluting not just China but the world. We established to you how by reducing Iranian and US-Russian stockpiles and by combating the biggest existential threat, i.e. climate change, Obama has done a lot of them. Next, Iran deal. They tell you that apparently Typically, rogue states follow mutually assured destruction and actually care about their people. But assuming that they do, we think the unique threat of nuclear weapons in the Middle East is that it can be stolen by non-state actors, for example, or that it promotes the volatility and the conflict in the region when other countries identify Iran as an active threat. Therefore, by recognizing this, we think by using sanctions and disarming Iran, we've brought peace to Iran. But second, we think when they talk to you about human rights violations, it's a lie. Sanctions still exist for human rights violations. Only the sanctions that were placed for the nuclear weapons have been removed. But even discounting that, we think the counter solution of invading a nuclear rogue state in a volatile Middle East is just a terrible idea at the face of it. Therefore, by preventing nuclear conflict, we've also won that clash. The last thing, which was kind of a throwaway statement in the last minutes of their speech, was the South China Sea. First, it is again a lie that Obama hasn't done anything here. Land redistribution in Philippines, for example, is how he's protected our allies. But second, by the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, which is the TPP, he's provided leverage for the Southeast Asian economies to use. By excluding China from these negotiations, he's given them mobilize and leverage for them in another way, in an alternative way, and this is a better way of doing this. As a result of their case being comprehensively taken down, we've already won this debate. What is my constructive in this debate? The Obama administration has created democratic outcomes using constructive measures. If we can show you that rogue and undemocratic regimes that were entrenching their power have moved towards democracy, self-determination, and human rights as a result of Obama's foreign policy, then it's a massive benefit that contributes to the list of active successes of the Obama administration that we established from first speech. Obama, therefore, has utilized non-conventional means of engagement to deal with rogue and dictatorial regimes. That is to say, his administration abandoned conventional Washington wisdom by using new constructive means like targeted sanctions and soft power to push a transition towards democracy and take it.
So why is it beneficial for the United States to exclude China and to not engage with them and to be friends with them?
You cannot say that we have to go to war with China and at the same time also say that we shouldn't exclude China. What we rather push to you is that he created leverage to be utilized against China for negotiations that bring peace. So we already gave you the example of the Iran deal where the sanctions and negotiations are used. But let's look at the other examples of this use towards rogue nations. The most important case of this has to be Myanmar, where a military junta with no immediate threats to its power voluntarily gave its regime away towards democracy. By utilizing cycles of placing and reducing targeted sanctions, Obama got European nations and Japan to incentivize Myanmar into this transition. By consistently lifting long-standing sanctions on Myanmar as and when they ceded to a civilian government from 2011-12 to all the way till 2016, we have created democracy out of 50 years of military junta. This is furthermore supplemented by multiple visits of John Kerry and Obama to Myanmar, which creates soft power. The next example we see here is Cuba. Obama created a work in progress in Cuba out of previously non-existent negotiations. By lifting sanctions off Cuba, we actively created market liberalization that started the progress towards democracy. Therefore, we argue while, for example, Obama dances in Cuba, it brings recognition to Cuba and includes them in the global negotiating table and a change from the isolation that they support. Obama was a prudent POTUS. Very proud to oppose.
Proposing for the House is Karen, second speaker. Second speaker, yes. Third, okay, Dennis.
Ladies and gentlemen, do you think that hundreds of thousands of people dying in Syria or fleeing because of the war is more important than some polar bears not having a home in the North Pole? We believe that Iraq and Syria are priorities that are much bigger than COP21 or the Paris Summit because they are immediate harm to human lives in this case. And we proved to you that Obama had a better alternative to act, but he did not do that. Now, before I move on to my clashes in this debate, I would first like to give some rebuttals to my previous speaker. So, my previous speaker, they have talked about how U.S. intervention has failed so far every time they have tried to make a positive difference. We tell you that this is not the case. They have actually succeeded in the Persian Gulf War when they have pushed out Iraqi aggression in Kuwait. They have liberated Kuwaitis from the domination of Iraq. We tell you that this is a positive change that the U.S. has actively selected to do. So, and we also prove to you that Obama had the initiative. Obama did have the initiative to do that, but he did not act on this impulse. Bush signed the state of force agreement. Yeah, that's true, sure. But if Obama actually had more sense and looked at the situation on the ground of Iraq, he could void the agreement because he knows that once he pulls out, there's going to be this detrimental harm to all Iraqi citizens. That ISIS might rise as a result of this power void left by the USA. Many military experts inside the White House have predicted that this would happen. However, Obama, in order to fulfill his presidential campaign promises, he pulled out his U.S. presence in Iraq just so that he could seek re-election and please his voters. We believe that this is a grave harm that Obama has committed on part of Iraq. Now on to my clashes of today. Today, we on the government side present to you two clashes. The first clash is on criteria. What is the yardstick for judging this debate? The second clash is on the content of this debate. Yes, before I move on.
Give us a reason to believe that an intervention in Syria would have been successful when no intervention in the Middle East has ever been.
I told you already that an intervention in the Middle East has been successful, and that was Kuwait. Secondly, on how we can prove that it will be successful. Firstly, we consider that Bashar al-Assad has continued support from Russia, and this is part of the reason why he can continue his protracted civil war against his own civilians and the Syrian Free Army. Now, if Obama actually had trained the Free Syrian Army and put a conscious effort into funding them, then we believe that with American support, they can even airstrike Bashar al-Assad. We believe that in this case, Obama could have ended this Syrian war much earlier, and Bashar al-Assad wouldn't even exist now because he would be ousted from power. We believe that is an overall benefit to whether America or Syria that Bashar al-Assad is removed from power, because so far we all agree on the fact that he's this authoritarian dictator that oppresses his own people. Thank you. Now on the criteria, what is the yardstick for judging this debate? Today on the government side, we tell you 5 criteria. Today, Obama needs to take initiative for this current situation in the Middle East. He needs to stand up to Russian expansionism. He needs to finish the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in a sustainable way, and he needs to focus more on cooperation with China and to maintain soft power through productive alliance. These arguments, notice how all of our arguments prove the link of Obama making the situation worse by acting passively at times or too aggressively at times. When he was acting passive in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, he produced an overall harm, and the outcomes were very similar, where all 3 places descended into chaos because of the power vacuum that he left. And on the point of China and on the point on how he was too aggressive with China, he should have taken a more soft-line approach that would actually please the Chinese and not cause so much conflicts inside the areas, and which is an overall benefit for both China and the USA. When he was supposed to act aggressively against Russia, he failed to do so because of his reset policy. So today, this debate is not about counting how many good things that can be attributed to Obama. It's about Obama's actions and how many of them had produced a detrimental outcome. Whether Obama had better alternatives that were plausible, but he pursued it or not, is the debate that we're arguing on this side. And we believe that we have proved to you these. Even if he had benefits, they can't be completely attributed to himself, because most of these benefits, so-called benefits that he has brought, were likely faults committed by his predecessors, such as George W. Bush, that he just had to fix. These weren't exactly results of his own policy failures that he had the initiative to fix himself. Our arguments are mainly focusing on priorities. Putting an actual end to the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we believe, is a much greater priority than getting COP21 passed. Because firstly, when you look at the thousands of people that are dying each day in Syria and Afghanistan and getting chemically bombed by Bashar al-Assad, this sadistic dictator, it is all more important that we remove this person from power. Obama had the power to remove this situation from even happening. He had the power to stop the Syrian civil war even before it escalated into this large-scale war. He had the power to stop Iraqi insurgents from rising again, but he didn't do so because, firstly, in Iraq, he wanted to please his voters. Secondly, he got the wrong focus on the issues. He didn't prioritize correctly when he was doing his policies. He believed that environmental protection is more important. However, we tell you on our side that environmental protection is an action that will continue with any president because the citizens of the United States are already conscious of environmental protection, and there is growing public pressure for presidents to pass environmental protection legislation anyway. So regardless of if Obama did it or not, it is a policy that is likely going to continue. However, what we're talking about are these policies that can be directly or indirectly attributed to Obama, but he did not have the initiative to fix when he could have chosen a better alternative. Secondly, on the content of this debate, the government side today tells you that Obama left behind an Iraq that was in shambles without a viable army, and this is why they could not challenge ISIS domination. When George W. Bush already poured in so much American money and American lives to make Iraq, to liberate Iraq from Saddam Hussein. Obama, however, he pulled out the troops and making Iraq descend into this state of chaos. Isn't this like this huge waste of American lives and resources that Obama could have pursued a better alternative of training the Iraqi army better or keeping his troops there to ensure that there won't be the rise of ISIS? They tell us that the parliament in Iraq wants Obama to leave. Firstly, the parliament probably regrets this decision because ISIS is in control large portions of its country. They're even unsure whether they can hold on to Baghdad or not. Secondly, Obama still caused harm, and we tell you that he could have avoided the agreement if he wanted to, because he should consider the practical outcomes that are happening inside Iraq. Secondly, on the point of South China Sea, today the government side believes that he should have taken a more relaxed approach against U.S. aggression, because what he's doing in the South China Sea is essentially making their neighbors forcing to choose between siding with China or siding with the United States. And we believe that this is an overall detriment to these countries inside the region. For these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, Obama has contributed more harm than good to society, and we are very happy to vote. Thank you.
We welcome the third speaker of the opposition, Dahan John.
When Obama walked into the White House, his policy was simple. And I'm using his words here, sorry for my language, but he said, "Don't do stupid shit." That's exactly what he said. He took a long look back at a history book and realized that Kuwait was nearly the only example of a successful intervention in the Middle East. You have Iraq, you have several cases of Iran, you have cases of Syria, Afghanistan. There are so many areas where the US has implemented this intervention policy they propose and drastically failed. He realized this. He realized that a good policy was using diplomacy. That was basically his line throughout his term. And as a result, we believe that he did receive lots of beneficial outcomes. We believe that Obama was a prudent for this. Throughout this debate, we've shown you many things. Our main problem with side proposition's case is that they never really truly defended their own solutions. They never truly defended why they think intervention in Syria in specific would have been good. Why they think that leaving white troops to remain in Iraq would have been good. Those are analyses which we expected from their three speakers, but they didn't really give it to us. But what is the main question in this debate? What's truly fair to judge Obama on? We don't think it's really that fair to judge him on conflict management, simply because these were emergencies. He could not have predicted them. They were largely caused by his predecessor, who used the interventionist policies which they so proposed. We think it's best to judge him on something which he had an extremely active choice on, things like the Paris Summit and things like the climate change. So firstly, their only response to climate change wasn't rebutting the idea that he was extremely successful here, but rather rebutting the relevance of it, saying that it's not very important. Well, we asked them, tell that to the people of the Maldives. Tell that to the people of Bangladesh, the farmers whose lands are being swallowed up by the ocean and are likely to lose their livelihood. Tell that to those people that climate change is not important. Tell that to the thousands of people who suffer and die of accumulated pollution almost every year. We tell you climate change is important. And furthermore, even if it's not as important right now, it will be important in the future. It's an important goal for countries to move towards, and Obama realized that. He set a precedence. That's what we told you from our very first speaker. Karthik told you that, but that has not been rebutted. It sets a path to a better future on climate change, which is extremely important. On both sides of the house, they failed to realize how important our world actually is. Now, let's look at the other thing we told you in this West where Obama had a choice, Iranian sanctions. We told you that Iranian sanctions were extremely effective and that they managed to take away nuclear capabilities. Their only response was, well, we don't know for sure whether or not Iran has nuclear capabilities. The same can be said for countries like Israel, which say that we technically don't have nukes, but we're not going to tell you. And the thing is that we acknowledge that some international rumors are most likely pretty true. And we're not going to leave it up to chance and hope that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. We portrayed to you throughout our speeches how it would have how it could have extremely bad consequences if Iran should have nuclear weapons. How using them would be terrible in the Middle East. How even having them would spark a conflict with Saudi Arabia, with Israel, and how it will lead to even more death in a place that is extremely volatile right now. They have not responded to this analysis. The government whip, furthermore, entirely dropped any analysis on the Iranian sanctions. They did not say a single word about that. We told you several things. We told you that they're not legitimizing bad governments as they're keeping other sanctions up. We told you that mutually assured destruction does not work in that area, so these nuclear weapons were likely to be used. We showed you that Obama's policy for removing nuclear weapons in Iran was extremely useful, and as a result, we win that clash. And lastly, what did we tell you? We told you in DLO that democracy was a good outcome, and that Obama spread that in the best way possible. He spread that in Myanmar, he spread that in Cuba. In Cuba, where he liberalized the economy, and that translates into free press and free liberal rights for the people. They have not responded to this analysis, and the comparative really is dictatorships in places like Cuba. It's dictatorships in places like Myanmar. And the thing is, they cannot simply say that Syria was more important. They still have to actually rebut our arguments at one point of time and tell us why what we said was not true. And they haven't. Which means that on a comparative, in a minute, sir, our entire arguments on how when he had a choice, he did the best things possible in climate change, the Iran nuclear deal, and in democracy around the world, that point stands at the end of this debate. Uncontested, we already win. How do you disagree?
Do you believe that normalizing relations with Cuba so that American investments can flow in is more important than stopping the Afghan and Iraqi wars from escalating?
Once more,
into
sir,
civil
this
war?
is the problem throughout your entire case. You're telling us that you think it's more important. That's not the question here. The thing is that opening sanctions on Cuba did not come at the cost of condemning Afghani people to death. The thing is, both of them could happen on either side. There's no reason that because he was friendly to Cuba, people in Afghanistan died. Furthermore, now let's talk about this clash. Talk about firstly why it's unfair to judge Obama on this conflict crisis. Simply put, it was an emergency. And also simply put, he didn't cause most of the conflicts put in there. Bush restricted his choices in an extremely large way. Their suggested policy for this entire conflict zone was you should not abandon the use of force. They told this to you from their first speech. But we responded to this. Simply because we responded to this as, just because USA has been doing this for so long doesn't mean it's good. They needed to show us why interventions were objectively good in this case scenario. And the BOI which we asked the DPM to ask them to tell us why Syrian intervention would have been good was dropped by DPM. They had no answer to why intervention would be better, and that was largely their only other alternative. So by their own criteria of providing other alternatives, they have failed in this debate. Now let's look at specific examples they told us and talk about even there how they failed. Firstly, Iraq and Afghanistan. They told us that Obama pulled out too fast. Firstly, we established to you that it is the will of the Iraqi and the Afghani people, a sovereign government whose will we must respect to a large extent. To that, their whip just came up here and told, no, we don't care, they don't have any sovereignty. Obama was a smart man, he should have just stayed regardless of what the people think. But even if he did stay, even if he did actually have the mandate to do that, we told you staying in itself was bad. We told you that leaving white troops would only lead to further resentment and further terrorist recruitment. They did not rebut any of this analysis, and they dropped that point. And as a result, we win on Iraq and Afghanistan. Now let's talk about Syria. Firstly, they told you that they didn't supply troop arms to rebels. Firstly, Obama did that in Syria and it failed, and he did it to a small extent to which the impacts is extremely little. He did it successfully in places like Turkey, in places like Iraq, to the Kurds, and as a result has helped the area by supplying to rebels. He actually did that solution. And then they told us, largely this is the main part in Syria, that they have to intervene. We've sufficiently responded to this. They needed to show why intervention was better. They haven't. Then they told us that we needed to that Obama was wrong in drawing the red line, that he should have actually followed through on his demands for intervention when he said we'll take away chemical weapons. So here's the comparative. Either they have to come out here and tell you that we don't think Obama ever should have tried to stop Syria from getting chemical weapons, which is horrible, or they need to come out and tell you that once Syria continued using chemical weapons, Obama should have been egotistical and gone in with his army and caused widespread death. Both of those alternatives are horrible. We think Obama did the better thing, and deterrence didn't really drastically decrease, and that's not really that big of an impact on their side of the house. We are currently doing airstrikes, contrary to what they think. That solution is happening, but it hasn't killed Assad yet. And the thing is that, okay, so that's the entire point on the conflict zones. Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, they're three examples taken down by their own criteria. So what is the last question we need to ask? Question about China and Russia on intervention. Let's look at what USA actually had the capability to do. They are telling us that USA could have gone into Crimea and stopped Russia from invading. Well, ladies and gentlemen, no one really has won a long winter war with Russia in a very long time. And USA isn't likely to do that either. They can't continuously supply troops to those areas. Russia would have survived and deterrence wouldn't have gone down. China is aggressive because it needs to be and asserting its influence. USA has actually deterred conflict in those areas. He promoted unilateralism, he promoted the world acting together responsibly, and as a result, he was a prudent POTUS, very proud to oppose.
Third speaker for the proposition is Karen. I'm sorry. And first speaker, it's now my pleasure to ask Karthik to reply.
Team Taiwan committed the same mistake that most presidents before Obama did. That is, to look at foreign policy as being exclusively about military outcomes. It's a mistake Team Taiwan made, but it's not a mistake that Obama made. He had the vision to turn away from the traditional wisdom of deterrence and intervention that caused misery in Vietnam, Iraq, and contributed to this situation in the Middle East. We told you from the start, from the very first sentence of our case, that this is about so much more than the military. And they conceded this. They said the outcomes that we pointed to were actually good. They just said they were less important. So we've already won on the criteria of diplomacy and of more important issues and prioritization of issues. We will engage in their criteria as well and still win. Because they contradicted themselves and created no clear case when they said he was too passive in the Middle East, he was too aggressive with China, we had absolutely no clarity on where he should do what. The only thing they seem to have guiding them is hindsight. That's not a judgment on foreign policy. I'll segment this reply issue by issue. Three biggest issues in this debate. First, the Iran deal. Second, climate change. And third, Syria. First, on the Iran deal. We gave you comprehensive analysis from First Speech on its importance and benefits. The only thing we heard from them in response was some weak and scattered rebuttals from DPM on rumors and human rights violations. Our second speaker immediately took this down by pointing out the harms, even if these rumors weren't true, the harms of happening, even if it was possible that Iran had nuclear weapons or was capable of developing nuclear weapons. We pointed to the tremendous harms that Obama prevented by having this Iran nuclear deal. That's what our response was. They immediately dropped this at government whip because they realized they couldn't win on the idea of the Iran nuclear deal. Clearly, we've won this important issue. We've shown how it led to a safer Middle East. We've shown how it prevented tremendous harm that might have happened as a result. Second, on climate change. This was an incredibly important issue in this debate. They should have engaged with it more. The only thing they could say was that Iraq and Syria are more important than some polar bears in the Northeast. This is much more. The fact is, it's not just about polar bears, it's also about the Bangladeshi farmers on the coastline, but the people who live in Maldives. It's about every single one of us in this room and outside this room who are going to be affected as a result. It's also about the fact that not only was it a tremendous harm, but also that nobody before him was able to build a framework to solve it. That's the importance of Obama in the context of climate change. He was able to build a consensus where no one had been able to do it before. He accomplished something that was previously considered impossible. That was a tremendous benefit that only Obama could achieve. Therefore, on the third criteria of Syria, this was the cornerstone of their entire case, right? They first talked about Iraq and Afghanistan, but when I rebutted that at first speech, they immediately dropped it in their second speech and didn't try to defend it. So let's look at Syria. They didn't point to us any alternative from the get-go of how he could have done intervention. The only thing they say is intervene, because deterrence means you drop bombs just to show that you can drop bombs. No response to us when we questioned them on how it would work. Why wouldn't it lead to Iraq 2.0? They failed to show any reasonable belief that it would have succeeded. They basically expected Obama to follow them blindly into suicide without any reason to believe that it would succeed. The fact they point out that hundreds of thousands of people have died is regrettable, but that's independent of Obama. The fact is, he recognized the limited ability they have to solve these kinds of problems. He recognized that it's not something the US can do something about. He recognized the limits of US power in Syria. That's where he was successful. The last thing they said was about the red line and deterrence. We pointed out to you that he was able to solve the problem even if he violated the red line, even if he didn't enforce the red line. He was able to solve the problem he meant to solve with it. That is, getting rid of chemical weapons. How did he do this? With diplomacy. Clearly, he was able to find better means than military means in order to actually solve the problem he was trying to do. Another president might have invaded Syria, got the chemical weapons and pulled out and left another 13 years war like we see in Iraq on the exact same criteria. Because he led to the Iran deal, because he built a comprehensive framework to combat climate change, and because even in their best case in Syria, he couldn't have done anything better, we proudly win this debate.
Now let me welcome the third speaker for the proposition, Karen. Did she already? She didn't do her speech yet. Oh. Okay, then Chi do the reply speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we say is that just like Obama, Team India has a problem with the prioritization of issues. We say that the opposition has judged this debate on whether or not Obama has fulfilled his election campaign pledges. He says Obama doesn't have to deal with any situations that arise during his term because he could not have predicted them in the first place. He says that because Obama prioritized nuclear zero and climate change, therefore those are the only things that they have to engage with. Those are the only things that Obama can reasonably do. So what we need to do, so what we say is that, unpredictable situations come up. And part of foreign policy is how a president chooses to react to these situations and how a president chooses to be able to not only solve the issue, but also to make sure that the bargaining power of the state and that the state's image and diplomatic relations are still intact and they're able to continue to do changes in the future. What we say is that Obama has not been able to do that. What we say is that he's never gone for the correct response when he should, that he's always by this very idealistic motion of non-intervention, even on the very extreme cases when it was actually needed, when the people actually of these regions actually wanted him to do it, and when it might have actually worked. Now, first of all, on the situation of chemical weapons in Syria. Now, they have said that Obama was able to solve the problem by collaborating with Russia. Okay, we take that. Maybe he was able to solve the chemical problem. But what we have a problem with is that in the beginning, he drew this red line and he explicitly stated, if this happens, then I will do X. And X was, I was going to send ground troops and I was going to show Assad that I meant it. But what instead that he did was that he said, he drew this red line, and when Syria crossed it, he simply said, oh no, but it's okay, I'll just remove the weapons out of Syria. We say that even though he solved that problem, you haven't created an even greater problem in the future, which is we believe that the credibility of the entire American nation and their threat power has been damaged in the future. And they have made a lot of the fact that threat power is simply dropping bombs on people. No, what we say is that threat power relates to other things as well. This threat power works in that if a rogue nation is about to do something, sometimes what they do is they will also consider the consequences. If I do this, will it be worse if other countries try to invade me or if they hurt me? And they say that now nations are no longer afraid that the United States is going to do that. And we say that you lose this kind of prevention of damages. Now, Team India has said that prevention of damages is a benefit. Yeah, we think that this, if the United States is able to keep this bargaining power, then this will also prevent further damages in the future. So we say that even though he was successfully able to solve that small Syrian deal, that at least he did not do it in the best way, and he greatly damaged America's ability to prevent further damages in the future. Now, they also wanted us to explain why intervention is better. Now, my third speaker, Dennis, already came up and said that there are successful interventions in Kuwait. Granted, yes, there were very few. But we say that even so, we say that Afghanistan under the US rule is still much better than Afghanistan under the Taliban rule. And that we say that the United States could have still found better ways to intervene, and we say that even when the governments wanted them to, for example, the Libyan government, we already talked about this. In Libya, 54% of the people wanted America to stay and help them rebuild a democratic government. And on that condition, Obama still refused because he didn't want to intervene more. He didn't want to help them build a stable government, even when it could have greatly benefited them and could have come at very little cost to them. So he said Obama makes very bad decisions based on this very ideological line of, as long as I don't intervene, as long as I don't cause further harms, then I'm not responsible for those harms, and therefore those harms don't belong to me. But we say that those harms still exist. And they talk about diplomacy and why this is enormously important. But we say that diplomacy is only important if it achieves actual outcomes, right? So this diplomacy with Russia, what has this diplomacy actually achieved? The only thing that they've been able to tell us about is this idea of a climate change deal. Yes, we understand, climate change is important, but we say that this is a trend that was going to continue anyway. People are aware of it. Over the course of different presidents, a climate change deal would have been reached anyway. And we see that secondly, by America being so nice to Russia and allowing them to do these things, it has allowed Russia to territorize all of its neighbors and to invade Crimea and to threaten Belarus and the European Union with cutting off oil supply lines. So what we say is that Obama has greatly damaged the reputation of America. He has not made the good decisions, and in the future, America's power is greatly diminished. That is why we say that Obama's foreign policy has failed. Thank you.